Then let's move on to the externally facing section of the agenda on engagement with our stakeholders. The first item within that section is visits that colleagues have made, both non-exec and exec, to contact centres, to spend time with staff and to listen to calls. There definitely have been a couple of visits this period. I don't know if anybody, Steve's already mentioned his visit to Chatham. Peter also bestowed his presence on Chatham. Are there any others to report? And any particular observations or issues that came out of them? Alan?
Yes, Trevor and I went to Bristol. Had a very good day there. Trevor, did you want to give your feedback to that?
Yeah, part of the day, the visit overran by 2 hours, so it showed how much we were enjoying ourselves on the visit, I think. So
let's hope the feeling was mutual.
You can tell me in a couple of minutes. Part of the meeting, we had a group of staff together representing nursing advisors, health information staff, and some of the managers, just for a general discussion. And I think they raised 6 issues, which I'll briefly raise. I don't think it's worth discussing now, but just to understand where the staff are coming from. And these are prioritised. These were in the order of priority that they thought were important. The first were considerable concerns around the individual scorecard for staff, where the group we met felt that it was being imposed rather than discussed with them. And they were concerned that it felt rather punitive rather than developmental. I think a lot of that was down to the fact that they didn't feel as though they'd had the ability to really understand the background to the scorecard and why it was being developed, principally because of the pressure to be online. So scorecard was the biggest concern the staff had at Bristol. Off-site management, we discussed it briefly earlier, but still a feeling, I think, that it's bedding in, and the managers don't yet know the staff for whom they're directly accountable. They hadn't really had a chance, a lot of the staff, to meet their managers face to face, so concerned that the only contact they were getting was by email. Now, I think we're aware of that, we discussed it earlier, but obviously the staff are feeling slightly uneasy around some of those management issues. They talked about how it felt over Christmas, and we've already mentioned that we have a very, very busy period coming up over, if I call it, the extended Easter period. But a strong feeling, I think, from staff of not really being valued for the very, very difficult period they had at Christmas. And one of the things they mentioned was the lack of visibility of senior managers. And I understand how difficult it is with so many sites. But people saying that, they mentioned that Nick had sent an email, but really saying we hardly have time to read the emails. It would have been nice to see someone senior around the call centres at the time. But the strong message from them was a positive message about can we do that better over the next busy period, over the Easter period, which I think is something you should hear. A very practical issue, which is actually very important to staff, is the fact that there isn't any ability to contact, for people externally, to contact call centres directly. They go through a national call handling system, which makes it particularly difficult. They quoted issues of child protection calls coming into the call centre, some of the Category C communication with the ambulance service. So Alan, no doubt, has picked that up because it was absolutely down his street. But just we need to give staff the ability to have calls coming directly to particular call centres. They were very, very positive about home working, and the message was, push it harder. Can we go faster? Push it harder. And the final issue that I thought was worth bringing to the board was the reaction around rostering. The majority of staff, I think, feel disappointed by where the rostering project has got. Was it the orange group of staff? There is a code as to whether you got the roster you want or not. And generally people feeling that probably we overpromised around how rostering might benefit the individual. But a plea, can we develop a system which is more flexible, or enhance the system so that it's more flexible? So I think they were the points that I'm simply feeding back their view. I'm not commenting right or wrong, simply they were the issues they raised with us.
I think we've got a sort of policy question here. I think we have 2 slightly awkward choices. One is to answer each of those questions, which will take time and may not take us forward, and the other is to leave the questions on the table, thereby potentially leaving the impression that that there are some things are going wrong which actually aren't, and where communication may be more the issue. So I'm going to suggest, I'm going to ask for your thoughts on this, but my suggestion is that we don't go through and answer each point, but that we take that as a steer for management as to the sorts of things that maybe people are worrying about, perhaps unnecessarily. I've got a couple of responses to that, Peter, and then Nick.
I think, those are very similar things that raised when I went with Ronette to Southampton, and certainly my view was that, except for one issue, which was about the oppressive management point, which was a slightly different issue, which we covered at the board, and I think it was appropriate to cover at the board. The rest of them were line management issues, which required management to respond to those points, and I know Ronette did, and she very kindly included me in some of the communications that she had by email. So I felt, as a non-exec, I'd fulfilled what I was required to do at that stage, and I think it would be similar for what Trevor's done.
Nick, sorry, I keep overlooking Ruth here. Ruth, do you want to slide in first and then go to Nick?
Well, it was just a question for Trevor and Alan whether you had regional director input, so you got the external context of South West Region.
No, the regional director wasn't available for the visit.
Okay.
That's an important point you raise, I think.
Yeah.
Nick.
I was just going to suggest, I agree, I think if we turn this into a game of ping pong at the board, issues raised and answers given, it's not helpful. But two things that I thought were important perhaps to agree. The first is that there's an informal discussion that takes place outside of the board meeting with those people who raised the particular issues, so that there's a dialogue. And secondly, that as we accumulate issues, then actually we can feed back in writing to the board on themes that come out, so that there is people seeing this and reading it in the minutes can understand that we're not just letting these things drift into thin air and disappear, but we're actually taking note.
Okay. I think this is a challenging one to manage, isn't it? Because we don't want this visit to become. I think it's absolutely right, and we're all pleased, and we want an opportunity for staff to be able to talk to non-executives, which is not the same as talking to a line manager, and to be able to express some of the things that are bothering you and are on your mind. That's valuable. We want that to happen. What we don't want to happen is for these visits to become an opportunity for a board discussion, which then leads to operational management feeling whacked over the head every time somebody goes to a contact centre. So I think we may want to think a little bit more about whether about how we handle the feedback from those meetings, and whether there's a when and how we put the issues on the table in the board. So I'd just like to log that, and we might want to have a bit of a think about it, because we do want people to have their issues addressed. We don't want to necessarily spend a lot of board time dealing with operational issues in that way, and we want to get the issues aired. Let's think a little bit more about how we do that. I think Peter's suggestion was Peter's model that he seems to have developed with Ronette seems to have worked very well.
I just acted as proxy of Peter's double for one visit. He's 6 months.
Tim, do you
just
want to
associated with this, on the home working front, the Finance Committee are having a look at that when we meet next week. So there are things going on elsewhere that the board might like to note.
I'm sure there are lots of things like that. So that's exactly. It's a good example of there are things going on that bear onto the points that are raised in a visit. Sue.
I agree with all of that. The balanced scorecard is one I'm really interested in, and if we could just make sure that we come back to that at some stage, because I think it's all about team manager role, and it's all connected in, and it's absolutely critical we get it right. It's a real shame if they think it's punitive rather than developmental, and we need to address that.
Good. Okay. I think that's absolutely right. So that's helpful. And what we should do then is think about how we build that into the seminar, which I'm suggesting that we have around the role of the team leaders, because that's obviously one of the key tools that they have. Peter.
I could give you a very brief 2 seconds on what Ruth can correct me or add to it. I did talk to staff who I met about briefing arrangements that are going to come up shortly, and because they did feel that they didn't really know a lot about what was going on around what we talked about earlier, the future of NHS Direct, basically. And I know that the chief exec writes lots of emails to people, but
not lots.
Well,
I write them about every 2 months.
Some, not lots.
Every 2 months.
Anyway, I think it's about the directness of perhaps the board briefing arrangements, which I did say would help, I hoped, and it also would allow, hopefully, communication come back. So we've prepared that one. There was an interesting point raised at Chatham about a little bit of inter-call centre competition. You remember when we had the World Cup or whatever they called it, they raised that again, and they've tried other exciting ventures, but they haven't quite clicked in the way that that one did. But they are very keen to maintain this sort of healthy competition, we'll put it that way, and I thought that was something we should pick up on.
Yeah.
There was an interesting sort of board where they put up the names and pictures of people who'd had compliments coming through to them, and I thought that was a nice touch, and it showed the very positive views of the public that come through to individual call handlers and nursing advisors, and that was good. Maybe a couple more things. I mentioned about the positive message from one of the team managers earlier. But in terms of the calls, which I think Ruth wrote a note about, there was a suggestion made that the board should hear calls which had a mental health content, as they were very different types of calls, and also where there was some aggression in the call, perhaps, or assertiveness of the member of the public, and how that's handled. And also a general wish to raise the profile of mental health issues around in NHS Direct, as well as children's issues around safeguarding and child protection.
Thank you.
Those were Ruth.
That's a very nice list.
Ruth was very. It was a very positive.
It was very good, and I think the other thing that struck me about Chatham was it felt different.
Different from?
Southampton.
The average.
I'm not going to mention any other specifically, but it just generally it just felt different, and I'm not sure whether it was the building or the people, but there was more of it felt more conducive to sort of a team working approach, and I didn't know whether or not.
Because I probably do more visits than most. Chatham is a good site, but we have many other very good sites, of which Bristol is one as well.
Okay, so I'm going to pull that together. I think we've got a little bit more work to do to think about how we handle feedback from these visits. It's great to see the board, exec and non-execs, out and about. I mean, obviously, some exec roles involve a lot of time at contact centres as part of the role, but not all of them do, and I think it's great to see people out and about. We did say that we would review the geographical spread of visits, because one of the things that seemed to be clear from today was that contact centres in the south seem to have had a lot of visits recently, and I'm not sure how much activity there's been north of the Wash. So that I know that's something that we said that we would do, and I think we said we'd do it around March to look at the spread of visits and make sure that everybody is enjoying to an equal extent the attentions of the board, and the board is enjoying the hospitality of contact centres all over the country. Thank you. Renette.
Can I just want to comment about the feedback there in terms of it struck me that one of the reasons why we wanted the board to go to contact centres was not only to engage with the staff, but also to listen to calls.
Yeah.
And so that we didn't just base our understanding of the service that we deliver on the basis of one or two pre-recorded calls. So I'd like to understand whether board members had the opportunity to listen to calls and what their reflections were on that, and whether we could report that back at the board as well in future.
Yeah, okay, good point. Steve?
Well, I won't mimic what other people have said about visits, but just to say that I did spend 3 or 4 hours listening to calls, and I was incredibly impressed. And some of these calls were quite demanding, and I was impressed with just how professional the people who took the calls were. Now, of course, when you're listening to a call, I dare say that they're on people on their best behaviour. They're bound to be. So, in between calls, I made an effort to actually listen to the one-sided conversations I could hear around me, but they were equally as impressive, if you understand the point I'm making. So, at least for Chatham, and that was my first visit, I actually thought the quality of care that people were giving was actually top rate.
Thank you, Steve. Ruth?
Just on that point, I think both Peter and I, the calls that we had ended up in 999 referrals, and it's, of all the calls I've ever listened to, it's the first time I've had one with a 999, but Peter's sounded as if his had a very different experience from my caller, but not from our perspective, and it was in terms of the handling of the ambulance trust receiving the call, left me with lots of issues which we can pick up outside.
Okay, fine.